Yes, that's right. You read the title of the video correctly. We all do indeed know who would win in a second American Civil War. Long story short, it's the Republicans. Yeah, the Republicans. But you didn't click on this video just for a lowball answer like that now. Hello, I am the right-wing Lutheran, and today we'll be talking about the Second American Civil War. It's something I've seen in the media since the end of the first Civil War. The idea of it has only gotten bigger and bigger as of late. Elections have become more decisive than they were in the past. Lots of tech has changed since the first Civil War, as well as the sides being very, very different than they once were. I'll be going over the most important reasons I think the Republicans would absolutely just wipe the floor in a second American Civil War. The most obvious being guns. In the past, every American had a gun. Now that number is skewed, with only 20% of Democrats saying that they own a gun, compared to 45% of Republicans saying that they own a gun. Pew Research. That's double the amount of gun ownership from the left wing to the right wing. That's not even accounting for whether you're in an urban area, rural area, whether you're male, female. But we'll be talking about more of that later, but don't worry. But I don't think I need to really explain how whoever controls the weapons and the guns will control the outcome of the conflict. In the United States, there are more guns than there are people. Estimates suggest that there are roughly 1.5 firearms for every person in this country, with over 500 million guns in civilian hands. Specifically, it's estimated that there are 120.5 firearms for every 100 people in the U.S. And that's not even going over unregistered firearms, all the different types of firearms there are. Your average Republican is way more likely to own not only more guns than a left-winger, but also modified firearms. The kind that you only need to make one simple modification and that can turn a semi-auto into a full automatic. See, these numbers grossly underestimate the number of firearms Republicans have. I wouldn't be surprised if 80% of all of America's guns were owned by Republicans. These numbers just come from whether you own a gun, not how many, not what type, and it's all self-reported. I know some farmers who have enough guns out in their shed, out in their barn, wherever, to arm a militia. I wouldn't be surprised about how fast some people would mobilize if a political leader told them to do it. I can name like 5 right-wing militias off the top of my head, but I can't name a single leftist one. All the leftist ones are in big cities. They use like baseball bats and Molotov cocktails, and they don't really have a plan. They just kind of go about, they riot, they protest, think something's going to get done, and then, do you know how scary that is compared, oh my god, I'm so scared of your little baseball bat, your little Molotov, when like the other side has AR-15s. This isn't even counting for experience, the number of veterans who still have their full-auto guns. But, Americans buy 8 to 15 billion rounds, of ammunition annually. And with 80 to 100 million gun owners, this translates to average, 80 to 50, 150 rounds per owner. And they could just stash this away wherever the hell they want. Anyway, of course the Founding Fathers meant it to be like this, being able to have the proper resources needed to revolt against any tyrannical government. Benjamin Franklin famously saying, "The tree of liberty needs to be watered with the blood of tyrants and patriots." But because of this, if the gun owners were equally split like they were in the past, it would be a very, very bloody war. And that's what the Civil War was. And it still is the most bloody war in American history. But nowadays, when one side, the Republicans, have such a high concentration of guns, ammo, and way much more modern military equipment, I believe that with this advantage alone, it wouldn't be a long outdrawn conflict, but rather a month-long revolution at most. Then, there is the rare chance that somehow it becomes a dragged-out conflict, somehow being able to not siege down liberal cities, but God only knows what would happen then with, the Call of Duty Modern Warfare type supplies and equipment techniques that would be used. Of course, it's not like nukes would be used. Neither side would go that far nuking their own territory. But that doesn't mean things like gas attacks, cyber attacks, and all the wonders of modern warfare that we won't be seeing till World War III would be used if it became a drawn-out conflict. The military. The military is a key point in any war, thus, who they side with in a civil war is crucial to any victory. I mean, it makes sense. The military is a fighting force of any nation, the one that usually hold all the guns and assets within the country. Of course, America being like the world exception to this. But I mean, just look at history. Whatever side the military ends up usually wins. The Spanish Civil War with the nationalists and the communists. The nationalists had the military on the side, and they had a military dictatorship backed by Franco. They won the Spanish Civil War. When Napoleon returned from Elba, the military was sent to arrest him, and the military literally went and joined him. And if it wasn't for excluding powers like Britain and Prussia, Napoleon would have been able to retake France. Of course, these are just some examples off the top of my head. I could name countless of coups that, without the military, would have gone into a full-blown civil war. And that's really what a second American Civil War would be. A month-long coup. Think about it. The majority of the military is conservative. Being patriotic and defending your nation has become a more and more right-wing thing to do. A record-breaking all-time low of 36% of Democrats consider themselves patriotic. Signing up to possibly die for your country whilst hating it doesn't seem like something you would do now, does it? Of course, it's not 0%. It's not like there are no left-wing people in the military, but the military who are left-wing, people within the military who are left-wing, it'd be jobs like, the JAG, the military lawyers, engineering, cybersecurity, etc. The more reserve stuff. While the ones fighting on the front lines, your average infantrymen, are going to be young, conservative men. I know people in the military, they say it's like 90% of our infantrymen are Republicans. Of course, they're probably biased, but there are other factors in modern warfare to consider just your boots on the ground. The military tech, airplanes, boats, and whatnot. The classic freedom Dorito. The tech advantage will be very important when it comes to any war, really. It's been like that throughout all of history. But the average Republican to have not only most of the guns, but most of the military and military tech on their side, that would be even bigger advantage than they already have. It's just so funny to me how these liberals think that the cartel could beat the American military. America has the best military in the whole world, but it's lots of liberals like this who will try to start something like that, a civil war, then just immediately get crushed by the might of the American military. Of course, the military has been specifically conditioned to follow orders, right? So if the high command becomes left-leaning, the more likely the military will follow suit, especially if it's like a low-level, revolt, not like a full-blown uprising. It's something interesting because, during the Biden years, the officers in the high command became more and more left-leaning, while once again the normal base infantry remained conservative. If something would have happened then, the military would have been more iffy, right? But especially how it is now, with Donald Trump in power and all the officers, leaning more right-wing and being able to openly lean more right-wing and more Republican, it's way more likely in Trump's favor right now. But, if the White House becomes blue again, it could shift once again. And basically what I'm trying to say is that because the military is a mix of people all over the USA with differing values, who giving them orders will be a factor, but still, the military is a majority right-wing and willing to revolt if need be. Of course, there's different branches of the military, Navy, Air Force, all this stuff, but I feel like the biggest branch that will have, the biggest difference between them all is the National Guard. See, the National Guard is different. If a state doesn't obey the orders of the federal government, the National Guard is supposed to listen to the state in theory, of course. So, this is why, blue states having a chance to a certain extent. Something I've been seeing, especially with people on the right versus people on the left, fighting and dying, is that the majority of people on the right who believe in an afterlife versus the people on the left, especially the far left, who would try to fight at least, the far left would, and they believe that there's nothing after you die. Thus, they are less willing to die for anything, really, compared to the right-winger who believes, after I die, I'm going to go to heaven, I'm going to go, it's going to be objectively better than what it is now. Not even objectively, it just will be better than it is right now. So people on the right are more willing to die for a cause compared to people on the left. That's my point here. Anyway, the National Guard is how you get individual states having their own army. This is, of course, what happened the first time around when, the first Civil War, but that was back when the rebelling states wanted independence. But if you were to run it back today, I feel like it wouldn't be, the Republicans or the Democrats wanting independence. It'd be two factions, or, the two parties, of course, declaring themselves to be the rightful president and the rightful party to rule America, and we would have two presidents. I'll talk more about this later, but to wrap up this part, pretty much, the military will play a key role in who the victor of the conflict will be. Even if the White House becomes blue again, the majority of the military remains red. Rural versus urban. The divide between the rural versus urban areas have been seen all throughout history in every country, every civilization ever made. It's no different in the US. There's just something about living on the West Coast that just makes you more liberal. One of these days I'll go over and actually explain the divide more, but for the sake of this video, urban equaling Democrat and rural equaling Republican. In the case of a Second American Civil War, this next thing, you've probably heard the term for this before, but it's true. There is no such thing as a liberal state, only liberal cities. Take a look at this map from the 2024 election, by county. That's fascinating. Only areas in blue, the very urban areas, close-knit cities. And, it would be these concentration of blue cities that where any resistance and the most fighting will be. It's not like the first Civil War, fighting on open fields. With Democrats concentrated in these cities, it could be airstrikes galore if you wanted to. So, if it ended up being a full-blown fighting, it would end up being urban warfare, yes. But going back to the numbers of guns owned by Democrats, if you do the math and average out the amount of Democrats living in urban areas compared to the rest of the U.S., you get urban gun ownership down to 16%. This basically meaning 2 out of every 10 people within these cities would have a weapon. Also probably being a smaller firearm too, like a pistol, not like an, AR. Like I said, with one side of having the military tech and the rest of the U.S., with the manpower, food, resources, these cities would eventually be starved or lack whatever vital resource that they need. I could go on, but basically these cities would inevitably just be cut off from the rest of the U.S. You could put up cell blockers to isolate them even more, jamming their signal and whatnot. Which, what I'm saying is that prolonged conflict would not work unless these cities are ready for lots and lots of death. Guess what? Here's the thing, right? The fighting would never get to that point anyway. That's pretty much what I've been saying. The biggest counter-argument I get when discussing the Second American Civil War is a historical example of the Russian Civil War, how the communists were in urban areas and they were still able to conquer the whole of Russia. America and Russia have very different population density and infrastructure. The whole reason the Russians were able to take over Russia, whilst being an urban-centered, was basically because all of Russia's modern industrial and technological capabilities relied on the 3 biggest cities, that being Moscow, St. Petersburg, and Volgograd. But in Russia, if you control these 3 cities, where all the population is, everything outside that is basically just small towns or villages along, with a Siberian wasteland. The only main form of infrastructure connecting the whole empire to Siberia was secured, yes, but they would never be able to fight back. Now, compare that to America. Yes, with more cities, but these cities couldn't survive on their own. They need the rest of America backing them. Sure, certain states like California could sustain itself, but once again, this is not blue states. There's no such thing as a blue state, only blue cities fighting back. The Republicans would be able to sustain themselves while also, if necessary, being able to completely obliterate these other cities. Now here's the question on everybody's mind. How does it start? Who starts it? Right? How would a civil war happen again? Now that I've gone over all these reasons why the Republicans would just absolutely obliterate the Democrats in the Second Civil War, how would this scenario even take place in the first place? Well, I believe in the current state that we are today, 2025, with Trump and whatnot, we are very, very far from a civil war. I believe the only way a civil war even starts in a modern day is if the Republicans start it. Why do I say this? Well, with the info we just gone over, any attempt at a left-wing revolt in the current state of things how they are today wouldn't even be categorized as a war. Just another one of their stupid damn riots or protests that gets put down. And if it did start to become, increasingly more violent, the army would be sent in to crush it. Think about what's happening in LA right now, or not right now, I guess earlier this year. And now, instead of the Marines just kind of standing there and pushing people with the neck, now have the Marines be allowed to open fire into crowds. With the crowds barely fighting back, of course. That's the most of a left-wing uprising we'll ever get. It's just going to bring whatever city it's happening in into anarchy until the military arrives. It is because of this lack of strength that the left has and lack of readiness and armament that the only way some situation would spiral into a civil war or revolution would be started by the armed, angry Republicans. It's it's just crazy to me that the left has become so much more violent over recent years, yet the majority of them won't obtain guns or better weapons even. Do you think that, especially now, because of their worldview, it's like, oh my god, Trump is Hitler, we need to do something now. Yet they don't even have the capabilities to defend themselves. They won't. The whole basis of them having any say or any power whatsoever is based off the fact that we say civil. The second it goes to fighting, the right wins. And they lose absolutely everything. The only thing between the left today, with their power and their, ivory towers, oh, that rhymed, to the left absolutely losing everything that they have, is a bunch of angry young men. Anyway, let's go into the realm of reality here for a second. I think the most recent we've ever been to a civil war is two times. The 2020 election and the Trump assassination attempt. Of course, as cool as interesting as full-blown Second American Civil War is in fiction, with all its, how do I describe it? Not glory, just interest, The best example of this in fiction being The Fire Rises. It's basically it's a modern day mod for a 2016 World War II strategy game. The great mod, by the way. It's it's not realistic whatsoever, though. Just look at this map. Yeah, it's like they just shattered into a million pieces. It's not realistic, but fun nonetheless. Anyway, the closest we've ever gotten to a Second American Civil War, or like I've been saying, Civil War, revolution, coup, whatever, was when Trump was talking about his election defeat, on January 6th. Of course, January 6th was not a full-on insurrection. Quite the opposite, actually. It was Capitol Hill policemen just basically letting people into the building. But if Trump wanted to say, instead of this is what he said, was take back our country peacefully and patriotically, right? He could have just so easily organized with the militia and being like, grab your guns, we're taking back the country, we're doing it now. He could have just said something like that, but he didn't. But he could have. He probably would have been successful, but good thing he didn't, because, we're living in the good timeline right now. Anyway, the second most close I believe we've gotten, that being in July of 2024, when Trump was almost killed, just barely dodging a bullet. If he would have died that day and been shot on live TV, only God knows what would have actually happened. But I'm a firm believer into something of, akin to a right-wing uprising that would have occurred with Republicans, saying that the Democrats killed him, the governors and senators getting together to do something, thinking that the next leader would be like J.D. Vance, still not publicly announced yet as the VP. That happened a week earlier, but privately. So maybe J.D. Vance would have been the new leader of the Republican Party. Maybe someone else would have come and seized the power vacuum that Trump left. Maybe even someone more radical than Trump. But nonetheless, there would be uprisings, especially if the lawmakers and senators, governors endorsed the theory that the Democrats killed him. In both of these circumstances, the right has to start the Civil War, something that I hope I've convinced you on. But once again, this not only would be a fast war, but it would be an easy war, especially if the leadership was directly telling the masses to rise up in arms. It is because of these points of the Republicans having the most guns and most arms, the most ammo, the military being predominantly right-wing, the small amount of liberals' hive-mind cities compared to the vast openness of the rest of the U.S., filled with patriots. There is no blue state, only blue cities, as well as the pretext of the right and the Republicans needing to initiate the Civil War. I have proven to you why the Republicans would win a second Civil War. But you might be thinking to yourself, wow, that seems obvious now that I'm thinking about it, but why did you make this? Well, I am always just so annoyed when people say, actually, the liberals would win the Civil War. It just pisses me off so much. Anyway, I have been the right-wing Lutheran. I hope you enjoyed watching. Please like and subscribe. I put a lot of effort into these videos, and even something as small as that would really mean a lot. If you want to see anything in particular, just leave it down in the comments. Anyway, thank you for watching.